Welcome back to the Centasa video learning series. In this lesson, we will be doing the Deploy My First App lesson, which is how to deploy your workflow to production and process data in that production workflow. Objectives for this training include how to deploy your development workflow to production, how to create and execute production job or multiple jobs, how to preview the results in production, how to create a schedule for a production job. This training assumes that the Creating My First App and Low-Code Transform Process lessons have been successfully completed, as that resulting workflow will be referenced in this lesson. Okay, let's get started. So we're going to need to access the pre-configured app from the previous sessions. And I'm going to go ahead and access this training example app. And this may look familiar to you. We've got our S3 connection connected to our loader node, where we've extracted Apache log files with a regular expression and pushed them into an output table. That output table is now feeding a transform node where we've added a field and used a double split function to extract elements out of that data. Now that we've got this successful workflow and we are ready to deploy to production, we will walk through those steps. One thing I would like for you to first understand is if you go to the far left side of the workspace and expand that left menu, you'll notice that there's a development section with a workflow, operations, dashboards, dependencies, but no production instance listed here. That's because we have not yet deployed this development app into production. And so there's no production workflow associated with it. So to deploy this app, we are going to click on the deploy button in the upper right menu. This is going to bring up the deployment menu. Since this is the first deployment to production, no changes or modifications are necessary. So you'll notice in validations, there's a green check that nothing is running already in production. Nothing needs to be turned off or unscheduled or anything like that. The job is ready to be pushed to production. These are the two nodes and their associated code for the tables that are going to be pushed into the production environment. If you click on either one of these, you'll get a list of the columns that are included in that table and any changes that are going to be made once is deployed. Now, there's nothing in the before section because this has never been deployed before, so there's nothing to change. So after is actually going to be the result of the deployment, where we will have these particular fields, the data types defined for us. Okay, so to deploy this information to production, we'll simply click on the green deploy button in the upper right side here, and you'll notice that the deployment screen goes away, and what's happening in the background is this process is spinning up a cluster to copy all these configuration files to the production workflow. And as I mentioned, because this is the first deployment and there's no previous production instance, this is basically an immediate upload of the data. There's no need to modify tables or anything like that. And so if we go back over to the left-hand side of the application, we'll notice now that there is a production implementation and workflow that's been established along with our development workflow. So what we'll do now is click on the production workflow, and you'll notice there's a little difference from what we were seeing in the development workflow in the fact that there's no area on the upper section to unlock the workspace, because this is your, think of it as your gold copy or your production copy, so it's not to be edited or manipulated. It is to remain constant. So since there are no jobs to be run to modify this, we can go ahead and process data. And this is where that invoking multiple job nodes at the same time was mentioned in an earlier lesson, and why using the shift click method for specifying nodes is important. So let's go into that now. You'll notice in the upper section, to run a job, there is no jobs here to create. So we will do that by holding down the shift key, clicking on the file loader, and then clicking on the transform, releasing the shift key. We have, in essence, grabbed both of these processes now, and we can go up to the job, and now you'll notice the green icon is enabled with Create New. So we'll click Create New, and now we have a job configuration screen. The first thing we're going to do is to provide a unique name for the production job, something unique that you understand, and it gives you some information about what you're processing. So maybe prod training all nodes. That's a pretty unique name. The description can be anything to further define what is being done here. I'm just going to write description, but you can put anything in there that you'd like. It's not required, but it is recommended that you have a description in there. Define a tag section allows you to create specific job tags that might be helpful in sorting through job logs. It's not, again, not required, but maybe it would be useful to have a tag. So I'll just put training as the tag for this one. The next section we're going to look at here, process name, shows the two nodes, and this is the order in which they're going to be processed. Runtime is default to Spark at this time. The runtime field, this is where we are going to choose which runtime we want to use to execute the specific node. One thing unique about the Centassa platform is we can have different runtimes perform operations on different nodes, depending on what is required in that node. Maybe there's a script that needs to be loaded or some other option in a specific runtime that is not necessary for all the other nodes. You have the option here to choose those. So you can click on each specific runtime. And in our instance here, since we're in the training environment, we're going to use the training runtime. And I'm going to use the training runtime for both of these nodes. The last section here is the process mode. And remember, in process mode, we have a couple of different options. Drop and replace, which again permanently deletes the tables if they exist and creates new tables. Replace date range, that one permanently deletes only the partitions relevant to the date range that you specify and recreates the tables. Add new and replace modified, which is the default, uses source data like raw logs, input data sets, and other things by the respective app pipeline for the provided date range, and replaces the date that has been processed previously, but the modified date has changed since running since the date range. And add new only will not process any previously processed data, only new data provided in the date range. For our particular instance here, since this is the first time we are running and creating this production job, we're going to use drop and replace for both of these nodes to make sure we create new clean tables. The next step for our process is to understand the date range that we want to process. So if you click on the how much data do you want to process field, there's a list of options that are available. Custom provides you the ability to select a range of dates to process. And that will be the option we're going to choose here in just a moment. End days provides the ability to choose the number of days you would like to process, ending on a specific, either yesterday, the current date, or a last available date of the data. Last week, as it says, as described, is the last week. Last month, the same thing. Month to date, quarter to date, again, as described. Year to date as well. So for our lesson, we're going to click on custom. And remember from our previous training that the files we were working on were June 2nd was what we put in the development workflow. Our actual data range that we have available is June 2nd through June 15th of 2016. And since we want to create a new table here, we're just going to process that one day just so you can see how we can create the table and then come back and modify this job to process the remaining days. So in this first instance, we're just going to do that one file, June 2nd to June 2nd, click on save and execute, and it tells you that the job is saved, being initialized and submitted for processing. We can click on the activity log. As you can see here, there's already a cluster up and running. I had previously started the cluster before the training, so we wouldn't have to wait the approximate 10-minute time period for the cluster to spin up as part of the AWS process. So now, as we have watched before in other jobs, we're watching for this first node to turn to that white icon with the dashed rings around it that are going to let us know that the process has kicked off and that we can anticipate the data to be pushed into the table. Again, if we had any errors with this process, and there you see the node processing now, if there was a problem with the data that we were processing now, we would see this node turn red, and we would be able to then see which particular instance had the failure and be able to click on the log files for that particular process step to see exactly what was occurring. As you can see, we've just processed the first portion of the data loader in production. And now we're waiting on the transform process to enable and to kick off. If we click on the expand button here for the one that just finished, we'll get some detailed information about start time and end time, the mode that it was run in, the runtime type, which was Spark, of course, and the runtime that we used, the template that we used to run this job. And again, clicking on that little icon will give you just some detailed information about the job run and if there were any errors or any information that we needed to extract from the logs would be listed here. Go ahead and cancel that portion. And now as we wait for the transform node to process, we can go ahead and look at the output of this first loader piece. Again, same details as we've talked about before in previous lessons. This tells you information that this is the table output, gives you some names, and you'll notice here now we're in the production database and not the development database. And again, information that we've seen before, that we were using some regex to extract out of that Apache log. Again, the schema is the same schema that we loaded before. The state file, again, shows the date that has processed, the row count of that file, and the file size. And preview, again, will let us see a preview of the data in that table. The cross here will get rid of that. And we can see now that the transform is processing and waiting on the process to complete. Remember, we've got a couple more steps going on in there, and it is finished now. So I'll go ahead and close that out of the way. Now we can look at that output table for this process as well. Remember, again, our table description, we're in the production environment. Schema, again, with the additional field that was added in the previous lesson. Again, state file and preview of the data, which again includes our new field of data that was processed in the previous lesson. So now we've run this first job and we've got our data. Now we need to modify this production job to process additional days, the remaining data that we want to bring into this particular environment. It's a little easier now to configure because we've already run a job. So from the job section, we can click on our existing production job, and all we need to do here is make modifications. Instead of drop and replace, we're going to just do replace date range. And we're going to specify a new range. So remember, I said we had data from June 2nd to June 15th. We just processed June 2nd. We don't need to process it again. So we'll start with June 3rd, and we're going to run through June 15th. That's the only changes we need to make, and we can save and execute that file now. And again, the same process is going to ensue. If there wasn't a cluster running right now, this code process would invoke the code to create and spin up a new cluster in AWS. We're going to be seeing here that we've got this new job running, and by clicking on that arrow on the side, you can expand that section. And again, we see that the cluster is up and running. We're just waiting for the file loader process to start. There it goes, telling us that the processing is occurring. If for some reason you realize you may have stuck the wrong date range in there, or you've got something other issue and you just don't want to continue processing this data and you want to make a change, you can simply click the abort button. That will stop the processing and stop the nodes from running any further and turn off the cluster. But for now, we're going to allow this job to process. Again, it shouldn't take too long. It's just a few files, and they're not very big, and it won't take long for it to load those in. Once again, if we did have an error in our processing, this node would turn red, and we would, again, access those log files to inspect. But we see that we've got a nice dark green, meaning the process has completed. We see the green check in our activity log, the process is completed. And now we are waiting for the next process, the transform, to update this node. We can inspect the first output table to see if the additional dates have been processed. Go ahead and click on that field. Again, same details, same schema, but now in the state file, we're going to notice all the additional dates that have been processed, and the row count. You'll notice that each of those days has 25 rows in them, as opposed to the 10 rows on that first sample file that we were developing with. And then our preview again is just taking a random sample of dates and files to display. And you'll notice here the date time for this one that it chose is 11 June instead of the 2 June. And we can go ahead and close out of that section. Waiting for the transform function to pick up. It's still waiting to run. You can also click in any of these other execution logs, and if you needed to copy the log to clipboard to do some further investigation, didn't fail to mention this before, you can click on any of these little icons to copy that particular section of the log to your clipboard to do some further investigation. Okay, so now we've got the transform node processing at this point, where we're waiting for the data to finish. Again, we're waiting for that dark green icon to show up here. You'll notice the first file loader took about 50 seconds to run. This one's been running about 45 so far. So it shouldn't be much longer before we get the dark green completed node. Again, if we had an error, this would turn red, and we would use this section to begin our investigation into the errors that potentially are around our data. Of course, this transform may take a little longer because we are doing that split function, and these files are a little bit larger than the initial file. So this process may take some additional time. Additionally, in this left section, there's the ability to add notes. You can add notes to each of the actual processes themselves if you want to provide detailed information about what's happening or what the node is processing, or you can have an overall note for the application itself with the search capability within there. But as we can see here, the transform node has finished. We've got a nice green icon, so we'll go ahead and close this section and just take a peek at our files. We really want to look at the state. Yep, we've got all our files processed, and in our preview section, we've got data listed in our table. So at this point, we have concluded this lesson. To get back to the home screen, you simply click on the back button in the upper left portion of the workspace, and you're back to the home page. That concludes this lesson.